So today I want to talk about the implications of a tweet that is alleged to have been sent by a Texas man that stated, "Assassinate AOC," and was sent directly to her. Now, this same man is alleged to have participated in the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, meaning if things had gone just a little bit different, there is every chance and possibility that this man could have enacted his threat, that this could have actually occurred. So I am using the word alleged because legally speaking, this man has not been convicted, but there is every bit of substantiated evidence and credible evidence to show that he was, one, in fact, at the Capitol because there's photos of him there, which I will show, and two, that this tweet is substantiated from the fact that there are screenshots of it. So the reason I want to talk about this is because AOC represents a district in New York City that is made up of an overwhelming number of people of color. She is also a fully democratically elected official and, representative of her district. What I mean by that is that she is not backed by corporate funding. She is not backed by lobbyists. She was chosen from a grassroots movement of the people in her district. This is grassroots, fully through, organized, and elected. She is a representation of that. And given the fact that this Trump movement and a lot of the US government is overwhelmingly white supremacist in its origin, and the Trump movement in particular has white supremacist and xenophobic leanings, I think it's worth mentioning and talking about this from that perspective, where there was an attempt and a threat to assassinate a democratically chosen woman of color who represents an overwhelming number of people of color. And so I want to go over the details with that and explore that. So when we look at the information on the case, CNN points out that the Justice Department revealed new charges against the Texas man who allegedly participated in the Capitol attack and posted online death threats against AOC and another U.S. Capitol police officer. The person is alleged to have tweeted, "Assassinate AOC," according to court documents. So yeah, I covered that. We can move past that. But prosecutors said in a newly released court document that the person posted extensively on social media before and during the attack, saying a civil war could start, and next time we bring the guns. Now, maybe, some people might argue that the Civil War was not about slavery, but it was about slavery. It was about the racism of this country. From the Three-Fifths Compromise all the way through the Civil War, slavery was a huge component and a representation of the white supremacy in the country. And from there on, it continued in different forms, but up to that point, the Civil War represents that key component. And it's hard when looking at the photos of the Capitol, when hearing what AOC talked about, seeing the Confederate flag waved around in the Capitol building for what it was. That you're not thinking somewhere in all of that this represents that white supremacist root, that it represents that understanding that people of color should kind of go back to their place when people are calling for this second Civil War. And a lot of people, especially on the left, have been awkward about, should we support the FBI? Should we support the cops? And there's a lot of issues around that, right? This is a very complicated and nuanced perspective from the left. But in terms of the white supremacy and these types of perspectives on actions that people actively did, we don't have any other institutions in play to address this. And unfortunately, it might be worthwhile to put this in its proper perspective, because this reeks of white supremacy. This reeks of the types of perspectives of putting people of color down in this country. And to further back this up, the position that this person's lawyer took is, quote, "He did it in support of former President Donald Trump, but regrets his actions." And then they go on to talk about how he was just adhering to some misguided political hyperbole. No, he wasn't. To tweet all this beforehand, to tweet it directly at AOC on January 6th, to do all these things that he's being alleged to have done, he knew what he was doing. And I'm sorry, supporting Donald Trump only implicates the white supremacy factor further. We have to remember that Donald Trump, over the course of his presidency, while I know the Democrats and a lot of other parts of the institution have had racist overtones and undertones throughout all of their history, this particular president, though, implicating specifically him, has locked children in a border camp, has had an egregious record of treating Latino people poorly in terms of their access to the country, has called Latino people trying to enter the country rapists and murderers, has appealed to xenophobia in other ways with the Muslim ban, has appealed to xenophobia with calling the coronavirus different names that created a lot of anti Chinese sentiment to the point of enabling a lot of aggression against Asians and Chinese people in general, or East Asians and Chinese people in general, I should say. There is an overwhelming xenophobia that represented his administration, and the calls for patriotic education, the calls for a whitewashing of American history that he has called for, including the 1776 thing that he put out that historians have basically laughed off. You know, a lot of people said a lot of stuff about the 1619 Project, but Trump's 1776 thing was absolutely disgusting in terms of the way it represented itself. And so, with that said, let's move into what actually went into this. So AOC actually did post a tweet that talked about this particular person. Just wanted to incriminate myself a little, quoting the person. Well, you did it. So this person from Texas was arrested at the insurrection, and the FBI, put out this information. So here's what we have. There's the photograph of him allegedly being there. Here's another photograph, a selfie. And here is the tweet exchange where AOC says impeach, and the person says, "We acted with honor and we were not armed. We were gentle with the police. They murdered a child. Assassinate AOC." So we know that's not really true. There were armed people there. This person probably was not. That's fair. But to say we weren't armed and, all this, but then assassinate AOC after being there and doing what he did is kind of problematic. And so when we look at all that and we take into account that a spokesperson for AOC actually, denied comment, but what AOC has said in the past is that she often receives death threats. And given that the overwhelming majority of people who dislike her to that extent are people in the Trump camp, because Trump has called her out a number of times, Trump has called the squad out a number of times, she's a leftist, she's a woman of color, she is everything that white supremacy tends to hearken against. Even if you don't think she's left enough, she's certainly within a far enough left perspective that the right certainly considers her a threat. And so I want to look at her district and what she's actually representing. So again, being that she was, democratically elected purely across the board through grassroots means, she represents 696,664 people. That is more people than the state of Vermont and the state of Wyoming separately, but still, her district represents more people than two entire states, which means there are senators in the United States that represent less people than she does as a member of the House of Representatives. And within that, 49.8% are Hispanic, 18.41% are white, 16.24% are Asian, and that Asian statistic represents a combination of East Asians and as well as Indian subcontinent, so Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi peoples. So, you've got a very, diverse population within a lot of these neighborhoods. 3.71% other, 11.9, 39% black, 4-5% Native American, meaning that this is a very diverse group of people that she represents and was democratically represented in this, situation. So is it really an odd perspective to assume that she is a threat to a lot of the positions of the country? And when she talked about this situation, when she talked about how she feared for her life, a lot of people, both on the right and even some on the left, really kind of mocked her for it. But there's some substantiated evidence here that she was in fact under threat, that people did want to target her, that they want to target her not just because she is a leftist from the perspective of a lot of right-wing people, but she is a woman of color who represents the voice of a good number of people of color. If you're looking at that, approximately 700,000 people, almost 50% are Hispanic or Latino. That means there's almost 350,000 Latinos being represented by her in an administration and a culture of MAGA that is overwhelmingly anti-Latino, that has been, racist and xenophobic across the board. If we just take that on its surface, the attempt to silence those voices, the attempt to stifle that actual aspect of the multicultural democracy that AOC calls for, and hearkening that against and positioning that against the actual false representation that is the US Congress, that is the US Senate and House, with the amount of people who are backed by funding and all this other stuff, I think there's something worth talking about here and addressing. This is an attack on an actual form of democracy and is being instituted to continue the policies of white supremacy, whether the person realized it or not. And I think we should continue this conversation. This should be the start of something. This shouldn't be the end of it. When we call into question who's being silenced and who's being attacked. And if you look at the members of the squad, you look at Ilhan Omar and several of the other members of the squad, they're overwhelmingly people of color. The progressives are people of color typically. And that needs to be spoken for, and that needs to be addressed. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.